Detroit and Washington, 1940. 1944, a siren wails across Willow Run. Workers in wool caps and oil-slick coveralls watch a brand-new B-24 Liberator nose toward daylight. 4 engines, 110 feet of wing rolling off the line in about 63 minutes. Another bomber waits on the jig behind it. The clock keeps moving. So does the line cut back 4 years. May 16, 1940. The U.S. Capitol. Franklin D. Roosevelt asks Congress to fund a defense surge and to gear American industry to at least 50,000 airplanes a year. In the galleries, the number sounds like audacity. Across the Atlantic, it sounds like a joke. On paper, U.S. output then is small, a few thousand aircraft a year. But the order is not for paper. It is for capacity. By 1944, the stopwatch answers the scoffs. Production schedules, machine tools, and midnight shifts mesh into a cadence that will deliver on the order of 96,000 U.S. aircraft in a single calendar year, a practical fulfillment of the 100,000 ambition. The handful of factories of 1940 has become a continental system: aluminum, engines, airframes, feeding runways on 3 oceans. This is the story of how a line in a speech became a line of bombers, and how industrial math, hours, tonnage, tact, turned disbelief into air supremacy. May 16, 1940. With France reeling, Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to fund an emergency defense surge and, crucially, to gear American industry to at least 50,000 airplanes a year. The sentence landed like a dare. At that moment, U.S. military aircraft output for the previous calendar year sat in the low thousands, and the Army Air Corps itself counted only a few thousand planes on strength. But the ask was not for paper totals. It was for capacity, for machine tools, shifts, and contracts that could turn a number into a cadence. The primary text survives in the presidential papers and press coverage of the day. I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year. The administrative spine followed almost immediately. On May 28, 1940, the White House stood up the National Defense Advisory Commission, NDAC, to begin coordinating raw materials, labor, and procurement with industry. NDAC's industrial face was William S. Big Bill Knudsen, the General Motors production wizard brought in at a symbolic $1 salary to translate auto plant logic into defense throughput. The next layer came with Executive Order 8629 on January 7, 1941, creating the Office of Production Management, OPM, inside the Executive Office, formalizing federal priority control over materials and contracts for aircraft, engines, and the vast web of sub-assemblies. In 1 year, a presidential goal, May 1940. A coordinating commission, May 1940. A formal production office, John 1941. Numbers began to answer the skeptics. Using wartime statistical series compiled after the conflict, U.S. aircraft production climbs from 3,611 in 1940 to 18,466 in 1941, a 5-fold leap as educational orders, tooling buys, and subcontractor webs came online. These tabulations, Army Air Forces, Statistical Digest, and derived national tables, are the bedrock for any serious comparison. They show the curve that matters: how quickly a continental economy can translate policy into airframes. Policy scaffolding tightened again after Pearl Harbor. With America at war, Executive Order 9024, January 16, 1942, abolished the interim boards and created the War Production Board, WPB, consolidating priorities, allocations, and schedules across the entire economy. Aluminum quotas, forging and casting capacity, machine tool time, even railroad car loadings for factory feed. The Federal Register record is explicit. EO 9024 formed WPB inside the Executive Office of the President and defined its powers over supply, priorities, and allocations. Prior executive orders were amended or superseded to funnel authority into a single wartime hub. OPM, Jan 1941, had set the gears. UPB, Jan 1942, locked them. Workforce and shifts did the rest. In January 1940, the aircraft industry employed under 100,000. By the latter part of 1943, headcount crested around 2.1 million, a 20x expansion in fewer than 4 years. Women made up a decisive fraction of that surge. Contemporary studies and company histories converge around 486,000 women in aircraft by late 1943, roughly 36 to 37% of the industry labor force. The lived reality behind the Rosie the Riveter poster. The cadence changed to match the headcount. By spring 1942, major plants were running 24 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. A shift system that collapsed airframe labor hours, e.g., the B-17 falling from roughly 55,000 labor hours, 1941, to 19,000, 1944, as jigs, fixtures, and flow lines matured. People shifts. Hours saved. Throughput. Factories became arguments you could see. The emblem was Ford's Willow Run outside Detroit. 3.5 million square feet, a mile of assembly line, and by late 1944, a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, peaking near 650 bombers per month. Museum archives, plant flow charts, and wartime films document both the rate and the learning curve. The long debugging phase of 1942-43, then the explosion of regularity when tooling, suppliers, and training aligned. Willow Run wasn't the only source of B-24s, Consolidated and others built them in parallel. But it was the camera-ready proof that assembly line thinking could scale a 4-engine heavy bomber. Plant scale, hour-by-hour tact. Strategic effect. By calendar 1941, the 50,000 line from FDR's speech had already done its primary job. It forced the build-out, the machine tools, supplier networks, training syllabi, and federal priority systems, without which wartime spikes are impossible. The next 2 years show why that matters in war math. In 1942, the United States produced Sh-46 48,000 aircraft as the WPB regime bit. In 1943, the number vaulted to 185,000, and in 1944, it reached 196,270, a practical fulfillment of the 100,000 a year ambition FDR had thrown into the chamber in May 1940. Against that curve, Germany's 1944 output, about 40,000 aircraft, reveals the gap in both capacity and supply chains. Capacity built early, peak sustained late, strategic options multiplied. The context is now set. A public target, a set of offices with legal teeth, a workforce and shift system to feed the lines, and emblematic plants that turned minutes into airplanes. In the next section, we trace how these levers, priorities, metals, engines, transport, locked together under the War Production Board to convert ambition into a scheduling system the Axis could not match, month after month. The War Production Board, WPB, created by Executive Order 9024 on January 16, 1942, was the hinge that turned an applause line into a clock. UPB didn't build airplanes. It scheduled the nation. It rationed aluminum ingot by priority code, assigned machine tool hours, merged duplicate orders, and told railroads which carloads moved first. The order's text is blunt. WPB, sitting in the executive office, would direct supply, priorities, and allocations, abolishing overlapping boards and absorbing their staff so the economy would answer to one production calendar. OPM, Jan 1941, got the gears meshing. UPB, Jan 1942, locked them together. Two numbers show what central control enabled. U.S. airframe output leapt from 18,466 in 1941 to $48,000 in 1942, then $185,000 in 1943, and $96,000 in 1944, the practical realization of the 100,000 per year ambition Roosevelt had thrown down in May 1940. The Army Air Force's Statistical Digest and Derivative. Tables are stark, not because they're big, but because the curve is smooth. You can see the WPB hand in the lack of spikes. Capacity was built first, then fed evenly until the front could absorb it. Behind those airframes sat engines and machine tools. A 4-engine heavy bomber could devour more than 50,000 individual parts, plus 4 power plants whose own sub-assemblies had to be time-phased into the airframe line. WPB's allocations let Pratt & Whitney and Wright scale their R-2800, R-1820 families, while airframe primes synchronized jigs and fixtures. The result was a collapse in labor hours per airplane. The B-17's assembly time drops from on the order of 55,000 hours, 1941, toward that 19,000, 1944, as standardized fixtures, 3-shift operations, and subcontractor webs matured. The lesson is causal, not romantic. Priority codes, steady feeds, fewer hours per unit. Higher tact. The workforce was the other feedstock, and it scaled like a mobilized army. In early 1940, the aircraft industry employed under 100,000. By late 1943, headcount peaked near 2.1 million, with women accounting for roughly 37% of the sector. Labor historians and industry retrospectives put women in aircraft at $486,000 by the end of 1943, mid-1944, with concentrations as high as 40% in airframe plants. Those percentages weren't window dressing. They were throughput. With 24/6/24/7 shifts now standard, foremen could man and woman fixtures around the clock, push rework to off hours, and load test cells at midnight without starving daylines of mechanics. Policy opened doors, labor filled them, lines never slept. Factories turned those inputs into symbols the enemy could count. The emblem was Ford's Willow Run, a new plant of roughly 3.5 million square feet built to do for the B-24 what moving lines had done for cars. The debugging took time. 1942-43 were uneven. Then the system clicked. By late 1944, Willow Run was rolling a Liberator every 63 minutes, with bursts that approached 650 bombers per month when supplier flow and labor attendance lined up. Ford didn't build every Liberator. Consolidated, Douglas, and others did, but Willow Run proved that assembly line logic could scale a 4-engine heavy. That mattered because the European and Pacific air plans both required depth, enough heavies to absorb losses and still fill next month's bomb group tables. The organizational chart mirrored the hardware chart. WPB's priority orders yoked the Navy, AAF, and Maritime Commission to common calendars, so airplanes did not wait on propellers in one state and seat armor in another. Cross-licensing and educational orders spread know-how. Boeing's B-17 drawings flowed to Douglas and Lockheed. North American's AT-6 and P-51 families seeded webs of subcontractors, and jig borers, turret lathes, and presses were rationed to the bottleneck, not to the best lobbyist. In practice, a Cleveland foundry that poured engine cases could be told which lot went to Pratt first, and a Seattle rivet plant could be told why its night shift existed, because a WPB table said so. What did the other side see? The Luftwaffe's own Spear-managed output surged in 1944 to roughly 40,000 aircraft, but it surged into a shortage of fuel, trained pilots, and runway time under attack. U.S. production, by contrast, crested with logistics to use it, training complexes, ferry commands, and depot systems that could absorb 96,000 new airframes in 1944 without choking. The contrast is structural. Germany optimized late and under fire. The U.S. optimized early and under management. The result is the audacity-fulfilled headline. FDR's 50,000 per year ambition in 1940 becomes $96,000 in 1944, with the prior year already at 85,000, and the quiet subset. Enough trainers, transports, and engines to make combat aircraft sustainable, not just numerous. By the turn of 1944, the system could do something the world hadn't seen: feed global air operations without spasms. Aluminum billet left a rolling mill in one state and came back from another as wing spars on a date the WPB calendar predicted months earlier. A plant manager in Omaha could plan Christmas leave around a delivery that would arrive whether or not there was snow in the Rockies because that train had a priority. Code and a mile of other freights would sidetrack to let it through. This is what centralized priority looks like at scale. Not slogans, schedules. With the machine built, the question becomes impact. The next section breaks the story into angles: leadership and organization. Knudsen, Nelson, Krug, industrial process and tact, the workforce revolution, factories as weapons, Willow Run and Piers, U.S. versus Axis production arithmetic, and how numbers turned into air supremacy in 1944–45. The production miracle had names and signatures. William S. Big Bill Knudsen, pulled from General Motors in May 1940 at a symbolic $1 salary, brought Detroit's supplier math into the War Department's purchase habits. Break big contracts into schedulable lots, tool the bottlenecks first, and stand up parallel lines before demand spikes. Donald M. Nelson, Sears' former executive, then codified that logic as chair of the War Production Board, WPB, after Executive Order 9024, 16 John 1942, giving Washington the legal teeth to allocate aluminum, machine tool hours, and railcar priority by code rather than plea. In the final surge, Julius A. Krug, WPB chair from 1944, pushed late war, controlled materials plans that smoothed the aluminum, steel, copper flow, just as aircraft output crested, near 96,000 in 1944. 2. Organizational data points show the cause. Effect: Office of Production Management, 7 Jan 1941. Concentrated aircraft engine procurement just as output jumped from 3,611, 1940, to 18,466, 1941. The Capacity Build Year, WPB, Jan 1942, eliminated overlapping boards and enforced priority ratings, A1A down to C, which let engine makers, Pratt & Whitney R2800, Wright R1820, receive castings and forgings on schedule, preventing airframes from idling for power plants. Causality is structural. Political mandate, single scheduling authority. Materials and transport obey one calendar. That calendar made the 50,000 airplanes a year line from 16th May 1940 practicable, first as a capacity target, then as a delivered cadence that would put 85,000 aircraft in 1943 and now 96,000 in 1944 into Allied order of battle tables. Factories didn't just work harder. They worked differently. Airframe labor for a B-17 fell from roughly $55,000. Labor hours, 1941, toward 19,000, 1944, as manufacturers imposed automotive discipline on aircraft, hard tooling, jigs, fixtures, line balancing across 3 shifts, and subcontract webs for repeatable subassemblies, empennage, center sections, turrets. At Willow Run, the B-24's move from bay build to a true flow line converted craft constraints into takt time, a cadence measured in minutes per station. By late 1944, the plant was delivering one Liberator about every 63 minutes, with peak months near 650 airframes, while sister plants, Consolidated, Fort Worth, Douglas, Chosh, Tulsa, fed parallel streams into the same depot network. Process metrics propagated across the industry. Standardized fasteners and gauges reduced rework and inspection holdups. Interchangeable power egg mounts let depots swap R2800 or R1830 modules in hours, not days. Rail-scheduled kits, wings from one state, nacelles from another, hit final assembly in phase. Cutting work-in-process inventories. Cause: effect runs clean. Hard tooling, plus shift discipline, plus part interchangeability. Collapsed hours, shot aircraft, steady monthly takt. That is why the monthly Army Air Forces tables smooth out in 1943 to 44. There are fewer spikes because the line has absorbed debugging. The visible end of that curve isn't a number on a chart. It's a bomber taxiing out while the next one is already in wingmate, and the one after that is entering center section rivet. A pipeline, not a pulse. The other raw material was people. In early 1940, fewer than 100,000 Americans worked in aircraft. By late 1943, the industry peaked near 2.1 million, with women comprising 37%. About 486,000 women building airframes, engines, and instruments. Training pipelines, factory schools, union-run courses, and federally backed learner programs converted non-aviation skills into riveting, jig setting, and inspection in weeks, not years. The consequence was a human takt. 3 shifts that never shut down a line. Graveyard shifts reserved for rework and heavy lifts, so daylines weren't starved of fixtures and inspectors. 2 data points show how labor policy became throughput. Kershaw 6, 24/7. Schedules were standard by spring 1942, enabling round-the-clock heat treat, plating, and engine test cell operations that had been daytime bottlenecks in 1941. Women and minority hiring surged where the bottlenecks lived. Instrument shops, wire harness lines, light gauge assemblies, places where steadiness and fine tolerance mattered more than brute force. By 1944, these shops fed airframe bays with defect rates low enough to keep inspection from choking takt. Causality is cultural but measurable. Policy opens the gates. Training fills the bays. 3 shifts stabilize takt. Aircraft month climbs without quality collapse. That is why the aircraft industry headcount curve tracks the output curve with a lag of months. First you hire, then you qualify. Then the line speeds up and stays fast. The camera way to say it is simpler. A swing shift crew clocks in at 23, the jig is warm, and the rivet pattern they leave at 07 hours is the reason a pilot somewhere gets a new airplane on time. Leadership, process, and people are the 3 gears. The next set of angles shows the flywheel they turned. Factories as weapons, Willow Run and Piers. Numbers versus Axis output, and how mass translated into air supremacy on the 1944-45 battlefields. In wartime, a plant can be a weapon. Ford's Willow Run was built to prove that heavy bombers could move like automobiles. Chuck a 3.5 million SQFT under Albert Kahn's roof, debugging through 1942-43, and by late 1944, a B-24 every 63 minutes. With peaks near 650 airframes per month when suppliers and shifts aligned. Before shutdown in 1945, Willow Run alone turned out 8,685 liberators. Those aren't anecdotes. They are factory ledgers preserved by the Henry Ford collection. The plant became the camera-friendly emblem of a larger truth. Once hard tooling and parts flow were stabilized, takt turned minutes into airplanes. The visual mattered to enemies and allies alike. The Luftwaffe's intelligence services could count the monthly totals and still underestimate the reliability of delivery. Airframes arriving on schedule to depots that already had engines, propellers and spares waiting on the same rail priorities. That reliability, not only the peak, is what allowed the U.S. to fill bomb group tables, keep attrition spares in pipeline, and still seed new theaters. Plant by plant, the assembly line became an operational promise. The arithmetic of 1942-44 is unambiguous in official tables. U.S. annual aircraft output, 3,711, 1940, e o anansidade 466, 1941, 46 e infinuando 7, 1948, 84 953, 1943, 96 170, 1944, Germany's best year 1944, delivered about 35,100 aircraft. Some tabulations round to 3540K depending on inclusions. The gap isn't just totals, it's composition and sustainment. The U.S. mix included trainers and transports that fed pilot pipelines and logistics, while heavy bomber and fighter categories climbed together. The Luftwaffe's late surge ran into fuel, runway, and pilot shortages. This is the exact cause chain. Early capacity build, 1940-42. Smooth high plateaus, 1943-44. Strategic freedom. By the time the U.S. effectively fulfilled FDR's 100,000-a-year ambition with HAU-96K in 1944, German output gains could no longer be translated into equivalent combat power across months. The tables from the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest, compiled by the Office of Statistical Control, are the baseline for those curves. German leaders publicly dismissed American war-making early on. Hermann Göring sneered that Americans were good for refrigerators and razor blades, not airplanes, while U.S. planners built the institutions that made the insult untrue. The difference is not rhetorical. It's bureaucratic. Executive Order 9024, Jan 16, 1942, created the War Production Board, which could allocate aluminum ingot, machine tool hours, and rail priority by code. That let factories run 24/6, 24/7, drove aircraft industry employment to about 2.1 million by late 1943, and brought 486,000 women, roughly 37% of the workforce, onto the lines. Mockery didn't move steel, schedules did. The payoff is measurable. By 1943-44, the United States could absorb losses and expand simultaneously, arming the 8th Air Force for sustained bomber offensives, flooding carrier air groups with spares for a global naval war, and keeping training commands fed with trainers and engines. This is how an applause line from May 16, 1940, 50,000 airplanes a year, becomes a documentary fact on a loading dock. Pallets of parts, shift whistles, and a calendar everyone obeys. January-March 1944. The year opens with a cadence, not a spike. Airframe output that had climbed to $85,000 in 1943 settles into a higher, steadier groove. Factories hitting their three-shift stride, subcontract webs matured, and War Production Board priority codes keeping castings, forgings, and railcar loads in phase. What you see on the monthly charts is the signature of a system that has finished debugging. Thousands of aircraft delivered each month without feast or famine whiplash, the ramp already baked into the tooling. Behind each airframe count sits a second calendar. Engines. Heavy production of Wright R1820, R3350, and Pratt & Whitney. R1830, R2800 is time-phased into the airframe lines so that final assembly never idles waiting on power plants. UPB's allocation tables make that possible. Machine tool hours for crankcases and cylinder barrels, foundry time for heads and cases, and steel-aluminum quotas issued by priority rating, not persuasion. The payoff shows up on the shop floor as fewer red tags at final inspection and on the depot ramp as interchangeable power egg modules ready to swap in hours, not days. Priority codes, steady feeds, fewer hours per unit, higher tact, April-June 1944. The line speeds up while staying smooth. Labor hours per bomber and fighter continue to fall as hard tooling replaces jig improvisation and line balancing squeezes slack from station to station. The canonical example remains Willow Run, a B-24 moving bay to bay at a measured tact so reliable that shift bosses can predict when a given airframe will roll on its own wheels, about every 63 minutes at the late-year peak. Elsewhere, the same logic rules at Boeing, B-17, North American, P-51 AT-6, Republic, P-47, and Douglas Josh Consolidated, C-47 B-24. Parts kits rail scheduled to arrive in phase. Inspection standardized so rework shifts don't starve daylines, and a graveyard shift reserved for heavy lifts that would jam the aisle in daylight. Manpower is the quiet co-author. By late 1943, aircraft industry employment has climbed toward 2.1 million, with women 37%, about 486,000, filling instrument shops, wiring lines, and light gauge sub-assembly bays where precision and consistency drive throughput. In 1944, those non-traditional crews aren't a novelty. They're the reason the lines never sleep. The result is visible in the monthly totals. The peak year curve doesn't wobble because people make it impossible to wobble. 3 shifts, pre-planned overtime, trained floaters to backfill absences, and foremen who run a clock like a metronome. July-September 1944. The system confronts its own success. How to ship so much output without choking the network that must absorb it. Here the same WPB centralization matters as much as any rivet. Rail priority codes push airframes, engines, and spares in the correct order. Depots are stocked by plan. Ferry commands and training commands are scheduled as consumers, not afterthoughts. A plant manager in Omaha can predict to the day when a crate of R2800 accessories will arrive from Connecticut. A depot chief in England can forecast when a batch of P-51 radiator cores will show at the back door. That predictability, boring on paper, makes attrition spares an actually delivered promise, not a column in a staff study. Numbers carry the courtroom tone. By the end of calendar 1944, U.S. factories will have turned out 196,000 aircraft. The practical fulfillment of Roosevelt's 50,000 planes a year dare as a 100,000 class industrial reality. Germany's best year, 1944, reaches roughly $40,000. The contrast is not only totals but composition and sustainment. The U.S. output includes trainers to feed pilot pipelines, transports to keep theaters supplied, and engines parts to keep the front line flying tomorrow, not just today. Factory to flight line, the receipts line up. Airframe labor on a B-17 has fallen from roughly 55,000 hours, 1941, toward 19,000, 1944. Willow Run's Liberator an hour is no longer a one-plant legend, but the emblem of a national cadence, and the workforce composition that seemed radical in 1942 is simply the baseline by 1944. The War Production Board, born by Executive Order 9024, Jan 16, 1942, still does what it was designed to do: ration metals and machine tool time, settle inter-service squabbles in advance with controlled materials plans, and keep the rails, foundries, and mills answering to one calendar. The outcome is the monthly smoothness you can point at when someone asks whether 100,000 a year was ever more than applause. 85K in 1943, 996K in 1944, delivered without panic. October-December 1944. The curve crests and holds. Some months flirt with Parker 9,000 deliveries, others a little less, but the area under the curve, the year's sum, is what matters to a global war. Because the line has matured, the late-year pivot from one model mix to another, fighters here, transports there, doesn't crater totals. Because engines and spares are in phase, a bomber group drawing replacements in England doesn't cannibalize the next group in Texas. Because training output was planned 2 years back, wings have pilots ready for the airframes they're receiving now. It's what a mature system looks like. The calendar is the tactic. By New Year's, the claim in the title has ceased to be a claim. On May 16, 1940, a president asked for 50,000 airplanes a year. In 1944, industry delivered on the order of 100,000 by any operational measure, 196,000 airframes, with the previous year already at $185,000 and the supply chains to use them. The mockery that greeted the number in 1940 has met a bus schedule. The next question isn't whether the United States can build at that rate. It's what that rate does to a battlefield when applied across oceans. The answer belongs to the flight line and the map. 1944-45 air supremacy. From Big Week over Germany to the fast carrier offensives across the Pacific, where sortie counts and replacement flows finally read like the production charts that made them possible. Europe. Big Week to air supremacy. In February 20 to 25, 1944. The USAIF's Operation Argument, Big Week. The 8th and 15th Air Forces hurled thousands of sorties against the German aircraft industry. Schweinfurt-Regensburg lines, Leipzig, Gotha, Steyr. The dates are dry. The effect was not. With P-51BC and long-range P-47D escorts riding shotgun, bomber loss rates fell from the catastrophic spikes of 1943 into numbers commanders could sustain weekly, not monthly. Two anchors make the point. 1. By spring 1944, 8th Air Force had 1,000-plus heavy bombers available on many days. 2. Escorts now reached Berlin and back. The factories we counted in Part 1 had turned into daily mass. Replacement bombers, replacement engines, replacement pilots. So maximum effort could be scheduled on a calendar, not saved for crises. Through June-August 1944, as Overlord opened and the transportation plan cratered rail yards and bridges across France, the production curve kept the bombs coming. The number that matters to an army on the ground is not a single raid, but a tempo. Day after day of 1,000, 1,500 heavy bomber sorties in the Normandy, Seine-Loire belts, plus tactical air delivering thousands more. Fuel-starved Luftwaffegruppen flew less. American groups flew more, because attrition spares met the squadrons exactly when planners said they would. Industrial smoothness became operational persistence. The P-51 curve, when factories write tactics. By spring 1944, P-51 output and spares had reached the point where escort doctrine shifted from husbanding to blanketing. Mustangs were tasked not just to shepherd bombers, but to sweep, range and loiter over Luftwaffe fields. That required three inputs only a mature system could supply. Enough fighters to cover the route and free hunt, enough Merlin engines and tires to keep serviceability high, and enough drop tanks to make Berlin a routine, not an edge case. The result is the visual that veterans remember. Contrails at 25,000 feet, and P-51s down on the deck, strafing dispersals, because production had bought the luxury of aggression. Bombers in depth, losses absorbed without losing tempo. When 8th Air Force hit oil and synthetic fuel in autumn 1944, the target system finally hurt Germany where industry could not answer: refining. Here the U.S. advantage wasn't only the 1944 peak, 96,000 aircraft built that year. It was composition. Enough trainers and transports to keep pilot pipelines and depots moving, and enough engines and propellers to prevent a day's weather delay from turning into a week's backlog. You can see it in the fall. Bad weather pauses, then mass again, because the assembly line had produced surge capacity and recovery capacity. Pacific. When a continent feeds an ocean. On the other side of the world, the Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, TF-58, TF-38, fought a campaign whose sortie counts would have been fantasy in 1942. In the Marianas, June-August 1944, fleet carriers and light carriers flew hundreds of daily sorties, culminating in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 19-20. June 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey. Shoot, where U.S. pilots destroyed hundreds of attacking aircraft, while the fleet kept enough on deck to hammer Saipan, Tinian, and Guam day after day. Why was that sustainable? Because stateside plants delivered airframes and engines at a rate that let carriers reconstitute between operations. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, arriving with their spares and armorer kits by the pallet. Depot ships and island bases stocked to the plan. Move into late 1944-1945, and the metronome only gets louder. Leyte and Luzon strikes, then Iwo Jima, February-March 1945, and Okinawa, April-June 1945, demanded weeks of continuous carrier air and a B-29 pressure that ate engines, tires, and time. The factories had already accounted for that. The R-2800 and R-3350 lines ran with the steadiness of a clock. C-46, C-47 capacity kept the island belts fed, and Seabees plus Transport Command turned production into presence. Steel, fuel, and spare parts where the sorties happened. Willow Run's shadow over the water. It is not romantic to say that a B-24 every 63 minutes on a cold night in Michigan changes a morning in the Carolines or Ryukyus. It is arithmetic. Bomb groups rotating west to the Marianas in mid-1944 could plan entire training pipelines knowing their tables would be filled on the day. Airframes, engines, and Iron Mountain pallets landing in sequence at Saipan and Tinian. When X-Yaxid Bomber Command shifted from high-altitude daylight to night low-altitude incendiary in March 1945, losses from flak and operational wear were absorbed, not wished away, because the replacement stream was scheduled, not improvised. Germany's late surge versus a finished system. Even at its 1944 peak, roughly 140,000 aircraft, the Reich could not translate airframes into sustained combat power. Fuel output was collapsing under oil targeting. Training cadres were thin. Runway time was contested by day and bomb-cratered by night. The United States, by contrast, combined 985,000, 1943, and 96,000, 1944, with a logistics anatomy that let those numbers act. Trainers to make pilots, transports to stock depots, and escorts to make bombers decisive. In short, late optimization under fire versus early optimization under management. The calendar becomes a weapon. By late 1944, commanders in both theaters issued orders that assumed replacement certainty. Maximum effort tomorrow wasn't pep talk. It was a logistics statement backed by priority codes and railcar allocations written months earlier. If weather scrubbed a day, the next day's mass still launched. If a group took a bloody nose, the month's table still filled. That steady area under the curve, the year sum of delivered airframes, engines, and kits, did the strategic work. The factories had put time into American hands, and time turned into air supremacy. Close of the crescendo. End 1944. Europe's skies tilt irrevocably. The Pacific's air denies the enemy daylight at sea and strips away night on land. The production figures we followed across ledgers, 96,000 U.S. aircraft in the year, are visible now in contrails and carrier decks, in depot ramps stacked with power egg modules, in briefing rooms where tomorrow's sortie board is full because the railway and the assembly line agreed on the date months ago. The battlefield receipts are in. All that remains is the bill and the dividend. The aftermath of a mobilization that met its dare, what it cost on the shop floor and in the air, and how the numbers rewrote the war's strategic calendar. January-August 1945. The machine does not crash. It downshifts. Aircraft output eases from its 296,000 peak in 1944 to roughly 46,000 for calendar 1945, still a number that would have stunned 1940. Bomber groups rotate types. Fighter plants pivot to late blocks and spares. Training commands keep drawing trainers' engines because the pilot pipeline must finish the course even as victory nears. Two hard anchors steady this picture. U.S. air production across 1940-45 lands just under 300,000 military aircraft in total, and the single-model giants, like the B-24 Liberator, close with US 18,000 plus built overall, 8,685 of them at Willow Run alone. The math is no longer about ramping. It is about finishing and delivering enough to end two wars at once. Cost shows up first in labor. Aircraft industry headcount that topped 2.1 million by late 1943 begins to flow back into civilian work as plants shorten from 3 shifts to 2, then to 1. Women, about 486,000 of the wartime aircraft workforce, face uneven post-war retention. Some move by choice or policy into peacetime industries. Others leave when lines close. Unions and management renegotiate rates, seniority, and recall rules, while War Production Board officers translate victory orders into the practical language of contract termination, final acceptance, tooling disposition, and materials decontrol. September-December 1945. The policy scaffolding comes down carefully. Priority ratings vanish tier by tier. Aluminum quotas and machine tool reservations dissolve into the civilian market. Procurement officers issue stop orders that end whole model runs with a few typed pages. Yet even in the act of stopping, the system reveals its strength. Depots hold huge spares mountains, engines, propellers, instruments that will keep surviving fleets airworthy for years. On flight lines from England to the Marianas, commanders note the last wartime replacements arriving on schedule after the guns go quiet. A production machine built for tempo has left behind depth. On paper, the ledger is blunt. In Europe, sustained air supremacy from summer 1944 crushed fuel and transport. In the Pacific, the carrier air metronome and the B-29 tonnage pushed Japan past the point where recovery was possible. Those battlefield receipts cash out in factories as cancellations and conversions. Bomber bays cut over to refrigerators and tractors. Instrument shops retool for consumer appliances. Airframe primes design transports and airliners from the bones of wartime fighters and bombers. The same logic that once measured tact in minutes now measures market in months. Causality, clean and unromantic, ties the year together. Victory declarations, priority codes lifted, lines slowed, then stopped. Stocks and spares carry fleets while demobilization proceeds. The camera angle does not need speeches. A clock on a wall at a plant that once built a bomber an hour is reset to day shift only, and a foreman who lived by a midnight whistle signs the last acceptance sheet and goes home while the sun is still up. On the German side of the ledger, 1944 is the paradox year. Airframe output surges into the high 30,000s, yet combat power declines. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Oil Division, and post-war USAAF analyses converge on the mechanism. Once synthetic fuel and refining were cratered through mid-late 1944, training hours collapsed, operational tempos shrank, and sortie rates could not turn paper airframes into air superiority. In contrast, the American curve, 85,000 aircraft in 1943, 96,000 in 1944, arrived with the unglamorous parts that keep squadrons flying: engines, propellers, tires, radios, and trainers to feed the pilot pipeline. Capacity, not just courage, tilted the sky. 2 theaters, 1 dividend. In Europe, the cumulative effect of Big Week, Feb 2025, 1944, the Transportation Plan, Spring 1944, and the Oil Offensive, Autumn 1944, made German recovery mathematically unlikely. The 8th and 15th Air Forces did not depend on miracles after that. They depended on replacement certainty. When weather scrubbed a day, the next day's mass still launched because the factories had bought surge and recovery capacity. When a group lost aircraft over Mersburg or Politz, its tables were refilled on a calendar the War Production Board had written months earlier. In the Pacific, the margin showed up as duration. The Navy's fast carrier offensives of 1944-45, from the Marianas through Okinawa, flew hundreds of sorties per day for weeks, then did it again after a brief turnaround. That requires more than a full flight deck. It requires engines and spares in phase with operations, carrier air group pipelines that graduate the right models at the right time, and transport capacity, the quiet work of C-46, C-47, C-54 fleets to feed the archipelago. The metronome of production made it normal for a task force to reconstitute to plan between phases, instead of waiting for parts that never arrived. Post-war accounting writes the same truth in slower ink. War Production Board memoranda and the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest tally a U.S. aircraft industry that delivered a practical fulfillment of Roosevelt's 50,000 a year dare. The nation produced on the order of hundreds of thousands of military aircraft across 1940-45, cresting at roughly 96,000 in 1944, with smoothness rather than spikes. The enemy never matched the smoothness. Germany's 1944 peak came without fuel and pilot hours to spend it. Japan's late war production increases arrived under blockade, with aluminum and fuel starved, and with runways threatened daily. That is the lesson the factory floor gives the battlefield. Tempo without logistics is an anecdote. Tempo with logistics is policy. Costs are not erased by victory. The same sources that celebrate the totals record the human churn of a 2 million-plus aircraft workforce in 1943-44, women filling one-third of the jobs at peak, now pushed back into a peacetime economy as lines slowed from 3 shifts to 2, then 1. Contract terminations, tooling disposal, and materials decontrol were as technical as any wingmate jig, and just as consequential for families whose calendars had been set by whistles at 23 for years. The system that could start on command also had to stop on command. Doing both cleanly is part of the same competence. And yet a power bank remained. Depot inventories of engines, propellers, instruments, and airframe spares, built up precisely because the line ran evenly, kept fleets airworthy through the occupation years. Plants that had once measured tact in minutes retooled for refrigerators, tractors, and automobiles in months, their machine tools and skill bases amortized into civilian prosperity. The claim that Hermann Göring and other Luftwaffe voices made in 1940, that Americans were good only for refrigerators and razor blades, not airplanes, turned out to be true only in a way they did not intend. The same methods that flooded runways with aircraft went back to filling kitchens and highways with peacetime goods. The causal chain tightens neatly. A presidential target, May 16, 1940. Institutions with legal teeth, OPM 1941, UPB 1942. Capacity built before crisis, steady. Peak year output 1943-44. Operational persistence in 2 oceans. Enemy fuel and training curves broken. Victory followed by orderly drawdown. Numbers alone do not win wars. Schedules do, because they make numbers arrive on time. By the time the last B-24 rolled out of Willow Run, the debate was over. A line in a speech had become a line of aircraft, and the mockery that greeted 50,000 airplanes a year had been answered with the only rebuttal that matters in total war: delivery. The only thing left is the quiet camera pullback, the clock on the factory wall slowing, the floor swept clean, the whistles silenced, and the thought that an assembly line can be a strategy when a nation decides it will be. Steel can be counted. Time cannot. In May 1940, a line in a speech drew laughter an ocean away. 50,000 airplanes a year. 4 years later, the reply arrived not as rhetoric but as rhythm. Whistles at midnight, pallets on rails, engines crated and ready, and a clock on a factory wall that measured victory in minutes per station. The journey from mockery to margin was not a miracle. It was a schedule. The camera can still find the proof. In Michigan winter, a B-24 rolls forward, one every 63 minutes at the peak, while the next airframe is already taking wings, and the one after that is a skeleton of spars and wire. In Washington, paper that once said priority becomes a railcar that does not stop. In Connecticut, a crate marked R-2800 leaves a test cell on the day a depot chief circled months earlier. The parts meet not by luck but by design. Institutions with teeth turned aluminum, and labor into cadence. 3 shifts turned cadence into certainty, and certainty turned into air supremacy that arrived every day the weather allowed. The other side of the ocean learned a different lesson. Numbers on a factory sheet do not fly if there is no fuel, no runway time, no pilot hours to spend them. Late surges met empty tanks and cratered rails. The United States did something quieter and harder. It built capacity before crisis, then sustained it without drama. At 85,000 aircraft in 1943, chat 96,000 in 1944, and paired airframes with the trainers, transports, engines, and spares that make a number usable. When the guns fell silent, the cadence slowed cleanly. Priority codes vanished, lines collapsed from 3 shifts to 1, and workers carried the same precision into refrigerators, tractors, and cars. The assembly line turned back into peacetime, and kept its promise there too. stand once more at Willow Run's door. Snow drifts against the threshold. The floor is swept. The clock still hangs where foremen watched the seconds that stitched a nation's will to its workshops. A leader's dare became a delivery schedule. Disdain became a deficit. And a continent learned that in total war, the most decisive weapon may be a calendar everyone obeys. The verdict is simple and permanent. Mockery fades. Throughput endures.